So we're very, very excited to be joined by three of our scholars today. We've followed all three of you since you originally submitted your grants to us. And I do remember conversations and excitement around your work. And I'm so excited to see what you have to present to us today. So we're going to give our scholars an opportunity to present maybe their preliminary findings, their process, as well as potential challenges that they've encountered. And we'd really like this to be a collegial environment where if scholars have questions or are looking for advice, we can perhaps provide them with that. If we have thoughts about their research or career, we'd like to share those as well. And we really want to focus on a collegial, supportive environment. Our scholars have taken time out of their very busy schedules to share their work with us, and we're so excited. We're also very excited that many people are here to listen as well. So, Emi, I'm going to have you take over, unless Stephanie, you want to mention anything before Emi takes us away.
No, we're going to turn it over, and then at the end, we'll give a brief plug for the next event like this, but we'll wait until everyone's done.
Great. So Emi will present. We'll give people a couple minutes to ask questions, have responses, but Emi, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much. I'll share right now. Okay. So hi everybody, my name is Emi Ichimura. I am a second-year PhD student at Seattle Pacific University. I'm honored to be selected as one of the recipients of the Division 36's Social Justice Task Force grant. Without the support of this grant, I would not have been able to launch this study, so I feel incredibly grateful for this opportunity. And I'm excited to share with you our study called The Transformed Nonconformist, Familial and Religious Ethnic Racial Socialization in Promoting Activism Among Asian American Christians. The title was inspired by one of Dr. Martin Luther King's sermons preached in November of 1954, where he described what it meant to challenge people to have a transforming presence in the world. He elevates the importance of group awareness and radical change as we discover our shortcomings as parts of a larger system, but also as individuals. And I believe that Dr. King's message regarding this transformed nonconformist encapsulated what we were hoping to uncover in this study as we discuss how our pursuit of social activism is influenced by the different ways we learn about our racial and ethnic identities. That said, I will be sharing with you some of our research introduction and literature review, our approach and methodology, and lastly, the process of applying for this grant. So first, here's my literature review, theoretical rationale, and my background to this project. As you may know, the COVID-19 pandemic generated an increase in anti-Asian racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and hate crimes. Among these acts are racially motivated assault, vandalism, robbery, and homicide of Asian Americans, including vulnerable adults and elderly. This is not a new experience for many. Asian Americans have been historically viewed as perpetual foreigners and are often marginalized from mainstream American culture. An example I always think of as a Japanese woman myself is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, where 18,000 Japanese men were called to fight in what, looking back, seems like a death mission, saving other white Americans in an effort to prove that they were indeed American too. Within the current literature for discrimination among Asian Americans, several salient themes come up. For instance, prioritizing one's need to save face in order to enhance and smooth relations among group members and minimize disruptions. In a study conducted in 2021, Asian Americans reported low civic satisfaction or their satisfaction with their city's services and infrastructure, and yet they also reported low civic engagement or the motivation to make a pro-social contribution to the community. All that to say, by mobilizing an oppressed person to dismantle the structures and institutions that perpetuate their oppression, scholars have speculated that activism can actually buffer against the negative effects of racism. This effect has been observed in other minoritized groups, such as in Black youth in Dr. Hope's research in 2019. However, whether this effect occurs among other minoritized groups remains unclear, especially among Asian Americans. Previous research indicates that in an event of racial discrimination, Asian Americans have reported feeling silenced, demoralized, or threatened, so much so that we can't confidently say that social activism would mitigate these effects. Therefore, our current project seeks to clarify whether these experiences related to one's ethnic and racial identity can act as a barrier or facilitator to activism among Asian American adults. So specifically, our study examines two pathways in predicting social action to end racial inequality among a sample of Asian American Christians. The first being familial ethnic racial socialization, or the behaviors, practices, and social regularities that communicate information and worldviews about race and ethnicity to youth. This may be particularly important for Asian youth who exhibit steady and strong ties with their parents throughout their life course. Studies have shown that ethnic racial socialization increases within the family, and as it increases within the family, so does positive parenting outcomes, greater self-esteem, and social competence among Asian American second-generation parents. In contrast, other studies among East Asians indicated that increased familial ethnic racial socialization messages were associated with higher self-perceived discrimination, a sense of cultural dissonance, and avoidance, caution, and mistrust regarding other racial groups, with little to no improvement on preparedness to navigate through a segregated society. So our study also seeks to clarify the role of family in the socialization of Asian American populations, as well as that of their Christian communities, as we suggest that religious mentors may also transmit these messages. One study in particular found that religiosity provided social and financial support, morality, healthy development, connection to one's past, and intersectionality in cross-cultural belief systems among South African youth, all of which are conducive to an activist mentality. Thus, our current study will assess how ethnic racial socialization by one's religious influences may also facilitate motivation for social action. And upon researching about specific Christian values that are more tangible than religious identity alone, we found a hearty collection of articles raising a newer construct, the belief in free will, and how that leads to pro-social behaviors as well. In short, the belief in free will is a religious belief that people can act freely to accomplish personal goals and change one's life quality. So separating ourselves from determining the truth of that existence, several psychologists have taken a new angle towards this construct and are uncovering the practical and societal functions of the belief in free will. And research has supported that belief in free will is related to a range of outcomes, including increased social activism, pro-social behaviors, self-efficacy, autonomy, effective coping, and low stress, in contrast with more deterministic beliefs. While belief in free will shows positive impacts among predominantly white samples, whether this effect would hold cross-culturally is still under question, and especially considering how more Eastern religious influences involve little mention about free will of the individual self and more about harmonious interdependence, attendance to others, and conformity. It was surprising to find in a different study that in a sample of Chinese adolescents, increased belief in free will was associated with higher subjective well-being, suggesting the possible universality of the effect. While both belief in free will and an internal locus of control similarly endorse autonomous thinking, belief in free will incorporates a moral and spiritual responsibility. And in fact, as suggested by previous psychometric papers, our study will include both scales, so internal locus of control as well as belief in free will, to account for the unique influence that belief in free will has in the relationship between discrimination and activism. So, now that we've covered some of the theoretical rationale, let's move on to our methods. We will use a cross-cultural, non-experimental study design with a sample of 250 participants recruited from Prolific. Custom screening will search for US-based Asian emerging adults above the age of 18 who identify as Christian. Qualified participants will then be directed to a Qualtrics survey where we will collect demographic information, including age, region, race, ethnicity, generational status, gender, sex, denomination, income, and parents' highest level of education. We will also ask about the participants' church attendance and the longest tenured church from before 18 years of age, including ethnic and racial breakdown of leaders in congregation, denomination, and major regions in the United States. We will also include the following measures, the first being the Black Activism Orientation Scale, which measures Black American views surrounding activism, and this was revised for Asian Americans. And then we will also include the Asian American Race-Related Stress Inventory, which will be used to assess experiences of racism. the familial ethnic socialization measure, which will measure the extent to which participants' family educated them regarding their ethnic and cultural background, which will also be revised for religious socialization, focusing on a person's ethnic racial identity through a religious lens. We will also include the free will and determinism plus scale, which will portray one's belief regarding free will or lack thereof, and the Levinson internal locus of control subscale, which emphasizes internality, powerful others, and chance. The completion of the survey will not exceed 25 minutes, and after survey completion, all participants will be compensated by Prolific. And as for our analytical procedures, we will conduct a parallel mediation and a path analysis using the Lavong package on the platform R in RStudio. We will also include racial discrimination as a predictor of social activism and then assess the mediating role of both pathways, the familial and religious ethnic racial socialization. An additional mediation will be conducted to assess the predictive relationship between religious ethnic racial socialization and activism via the belief in free will. Still under question, but we may use a hierarchical regression analysis to account for its effects above and beyond an internal locus of control. In total, we will analyze a total of 11 path coefficients. So to tie it all together, what we hope to gain from this study is threefold. We seek to gain clarity about the role of family, but also the role of religious affiliation, beliefs, and communities in impacting behaviors of social justice, which we believe are significant to the hope for liberation. We also hope to highlight the significance of interpersonal connection with family and religious communities to continue supporting Asian American adults as they experience racism as a part of their development. We will promote scholarship and research at the intersection of race and religion by raising the voices of and identities of Asian American Christian adults, including the authors, which will be a Korean Canadian early career psychologist, a half Black, half Filipino American graduate student, and 2 Japanese American graduate students to lead scholarship that prioritizes diversity and inclusion. Findings will help cultivate protective practices for Asian American Christian individuals from heightened race-related distraught, and further inform dialogue regarding the integration of faith and psychology, specifically the paradox of what it means to be in the world and yet apart from it. So, where are we now? We are privileged to receive the Social Justice Task Force grant to fund our data collection and dissemination of our findings. We have also received IRB approval, which will be valid until July of next year. As such, after a couple rounds of review over our Qualtrics survey, we plan on launching the study hopefully by the end of this year or beginning of next. We have also been collecting a team of eager graduate students to join us as we continue with our process, and we're hoping to continue to improve it before we do the final launch. So finally, we will overview our experience of applying for this grant. We were made known of this grant back in December of 2020. Thus, our first time applying for this grant was back in 2021. The initial research proposal did not win a grant from Division 36, but in light of the fact that I have interest in Asian American psychology and religion, my mentor passed this project onto me to try applying again in November of 2021. I have prepared a second proposal since then and utilized feedback from the grant reviewers. We were also lucky to receive feedback from Dr. Elaine Hope, the author of the Black Community Activism Orientation Scale, and articles that informed our hypotheses. And after reviewing all of those materials together with my colleagues, we finally submitted a complete application in February of 2022. We received the grant later that year in June. And a large takeaway that I got from doing this the second time was that we did not have to give up after our first try. The benefit of applying a proposal the first time is that regardless, you will receive direct feedback from the reviewers, which will definitely heighten your chances of winning the grant the second time. So since understanding the value of feedback, we have utilized the reviews from our 2022 submission to also inform and improve our study. Realizing that feedback is really key. I also found that in my process, aligning our fit with the program aims really helped our studies stand out. My initial mindset going into these grant apps was that I was looking for support and funding for my own personal interests. I soon learned that this research could be so much more than that it could help advance research, practice, and integration among larger communities. So this time around, we really tried to listen to the needs of Division 36 when they asked us to describe a project that would advance social justice in religion and spirituality research and practice. We also lacked faith and spirituality variables in our previous application and decided to add them to increase the study's relevance. So in short, we responded to the gaps in the literature, which I think helped us make a more competitive application. It's important that we also made our study feasible and responsible for its budget. We figured that grant providers would want to know for certain that the funding that they give will be used wisely and is in good hands. So we provided a detailed budget, timeline, and calculated rates on Prolific, ensuring that we accounted for any potential need for financial support. And that said, here is our references. I hope that this was helpful and informative. Please feel free to reach out to me if you would like more details about parts of this presentation that I couldn't elaborate on. But that said, we wanted to thank Dr. Joel Jin, who is actually here in this call right now, and his lab members for pitching this idea and providing endless support and encouragement in the grant app process. We also wanted to thank the Department of Clinical Psychology at Seattle Pacific University. Also wanted to thank Dr. Elaine Hope from the Department of Psychology at North Carolina State University for her valuable research and investment in us. And finally, Division 36 task forces for making this all possible. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn about this research. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you guys so much just for the opportunity to share, for me to share about my research. The title of the project is The Religious Spiritual Correlates and Consequences of Racism. This is a longitudinal study of Black Americans. And kind of the overall general theme of the study is that we're wanting to understand how Black Americans are using religion and spirituality to cope with racism. All right, so a little description of the study. What we wanted to do, especially in going over the literature review, there is a lot of extensive literature in terms of racism and sort of the historical impacts of racism on Black Americans. I'll start on the left side, and if you look in the literature, there's a lot of different terms. There's different terms that relate to overt racism, covert racism, prejudice, discrimination, microaggressions. One of the things that I found as a prevalent theme in the literature is that all of these different things amount to race-related stress for Black Americans. Another word for race-related stress could also be coined as race-based trauma, which is very similar to PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in regards to race and racism and the prejudice and discrimination, what we see is that racism is something that affects Black Americans, not just from an emotional, psychological perspective, but also from a physical health perspective. It can contribute to different things like hypertension, high blood pressure, and it can also contribute to the overall religious spiritual health of Black Americans as well. And so when you take into factor how race is impacting Black Americans individually, if you were to take a couple steps back, you would realize that it was also impacting Black Americans from a community and institutional perspective as well. So that's kind of the race-related terms on the left side. On the right side, in my literature review, I talked about history of slavery and race, which is really, really important. And that side kind of covers sort of the evolution of race and how race has kind of been perceived and how it's been termed through time. So we know that race is a social construct that was developed in the 17th century, and essentially it was constructed to label who had the power and who didn't have power, right? Who was the oppressor and who was oppressed. And we know that slavery has continued actually much longer before even race was developed, or the race construct was developed. But during the 17th century, we know that race was intimately tied to slavery based on the transatlantic slave trade and the slavery of people of color and minorities. So in the 19th century, you know, we get the Civil War, so we get the outlaw of slavery. But even after the outlaw of slavery, there were a number of different things that happened systemically and institutionally, like the Jim Crow laws and segregation laws that actually significantly impacted Black American populations. And so even today, we know that in terms of racism, that there are a number of different systems in America, whether it's related to education or housing, or even just the mental health perspectives of racism that negatively impact Black Americans. So when you look at all of these two things together, the left and the right side, you start to see sort of a broader impact of how racism is actually impacting Black Americans, not just from an individual perspective, but also from a physical health perspective, a mental psychological perspective, a spiritual perspective, and then the broader community perspective as well. One of the things that has been really interesting to look at the study is that the way that how Black Americans normally use religion and spirituality. So if you were to look at the research, about 79% of Black Americans are religiously affiliated, compared to 72% of the general population. So this gets even more interesting when you look at the engagement of Black Americans that are tied to religiosity. So for example, Black Americans are engaging in religious services on a consistent basis. They're engaging in overall their spirituality, whether it's prayer or meditation or mindfulness. And so that amounts to about 61% of Black Americans are doing that, compared to 49% of the adult American population. I think that is, the literature described how religion and spirituality, these two things kind of go together. You can think of religion specifically perhaps as more of an organizational sort of, the church building, the organized set of doctrine or sacred texts. And then the spirituality can actually be defined more individually, more personally. So maybe how people pray or how people meditate or how people practice spiritual mindfulness. When you lump these two terms together, you kind of, it encompasses sort of the overall aspect of how Black Americans are engaging in religion and spirituality. And this information actually really guided our hypotheses, because for us, seeing how Black Americans are using religion and spirituality, the thought is, how are they actually using it to cope with stress? In general, if you were to look at religion and spirituality, when there's positive religious coping, so when people are engaging in religion and spirituality in healthy, positive ways, it does tend to impact their physical health, their mental health, and their overall health. And so, our thought process is, well, if Black Americans are engaging positively in religious spiritual behaviors, is there a chance that they're using those activities to cope with racism? And if they are, how are they doing so? And what are some of the methods, what are some of the pathways that they're doing that? All right. Okay, so a little bit of the progress so far. There's a lot of, this is the graphic that we have, and I know there's a lot of different terms in here, but I'll briefly just kind of describe that overall, as I mentioned before, we're trying to understand how Black Americans are perceiving racism, but we want to divide it into different constructs. And so we want to understand how specifically they're using religion and spirituality to cope with the psychological, the social, behavioral dimensions of racism, as well as we understand that not all Black Americans are engaging in religion and spirituality, but they may be coping in other different ways. So they may be coping in more psychological, more social, more healthy behavioral dimensions as well. And so we want to include that as well in our study, because we want to see how, for those who aren't religiously affiliated, how are they coping with racism, and what are some of the things that they're doing in order to buffer the effects of racism? Overall, it's been really amazing so far. We actually started the study. We launched the study in June. We started collecting data. We went through Qualtrics to create the online survey, and the online survey was sent out broad nationwide to a number of Black Americans in the country. And after the first wave, we actually got 1,800 responses, which was really, really exciting. The goal of this longitudinal study is to collect data from starting in June, and we actually collected our second wave in September and October, and then the goal is to collect the third wave in December. Basically, these participants are taking the same survey from the first wave to the second wave and the third wave. So we're not only just trying to understand how they're coping with racism using religion and spirituality one time, but we're trying to see how they're using it across time. And so what's really exciting is that, yeah, we'll be, in the process of collecting that third wave of data in December and seeing sort of the transformation or the transgression of how they've been using religion and spirituality. So those are the measures on the left. Those are some of the constructs in the middle, and then those are some of the references on the right side. All right. So in terms of updates and findings, some really exciting stuff. We were actually able to do a poster presentation in the American Psychological Association conference in August of this year. And we were able to present the first wave of data for the study. You guys might remember I mentioned how, our hypothesis is really, for Black Americans who are engaging positively in healthy dynamics with religion and spirituality, that they probably will have a more buffering effect or more protective mechanism against racism. So that was our hypothesis. And what we actually found was that those who were engaging positively in religion and spirituality didn't necessarily have those strong buffering protective mechanisms from race or race-related stress than we thought. And there could be a lot of different reasons why that is. There could be that potentially, race-related stress is such a penetrating factor for a lot of people's protective mechanisms, and that there's a lot of nuance to how people are experiencing race-related stress, whether individually or even from a systemic perspective. And so that was, for me, what was really interesting and what we found. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what we find after we analyze the second wave and the third wave of data, to see the progression of how those individuals are using religion and spirituality coping mechanisms. So in terms of, I guess, sort of the timeline, as I mentioned, we're hoping to finally finish collecting data in December. And then we're hoping that next year we can potentially even apply for more poster presentations and grants and publications. I wanted to also present this slide. This slide kind of gives more of the analytical perspective of what we're trying to study. And it basically covers a lot of what we just talked about. So we're calling it the Religion, Racism, and Health Model. On the left side, you can see that racial discrimination is the thing that we're trying to understand. And these outcome variables, whether mental, physical, or religious, spiritual health being, is what we're trying to see how religion or racial discrimination is affecting those outcome variables. And then I talked briefly about some of our various moderating variables. On the top side, you can see some of these religion spiritual pathways. Again, we know that people utilize religion and spirituality differently, whether psychologically, whether socially, whether behaviorally. And so we want to understand how those moderating variables are either strengthening or weakening the relationships between racial discrimination and the outcome variables. On the bottom, we have our secular non-religious pathways, our moderating variables there that are also kind of studying the same type of pathways, whether psychologically, socially, or behaviorally. And so from this, we can hopefully start to see more analytically some of the mediating effects between, for example, racial discrimination on those religious spiritual pathways, and how the outcome and what that provides in terms of an outcome for the mental, physical, or religious spiritual health being, and then vice versa for the secular pathways as well. So there have been probably two main barriers so far as we've kind of gone through this study. The first one was mainly just finding participants. When we did some of the analyses, we realized that we were going to need a pretty large population in order to get quality data from this, and we wanted it to be nationwide. We understand that, of course, Black Americans living in different environments and contexts, where it was going to be important to get a representative sample size of the Black American population. Once we went through Qualtrics and we were able to kind of get plugged in into collecting that sample size, the second main problem so far has been funding, and basically trying to finish out funding for the project. I don't know if it's just because of the pandemic, but it seems like in terms of pricing for a lot of these companies, I don't know if the pricing kind of just went up to collect the sample size, but and so I'm really thankful for everything that we've been able to collect so far. As I mentioned, we're hoping to complete the funding for the third wave of data, and hopefully and finish out the study to see some of what we found so far. So, and I believe that is it. So again, thank you guys so much for allowing me the opportunity to present, and I really appreciate the time and appreciate your guys' time in all of this.
So the title of my presentation today is What Helps Muslim Youth to Thrive in the Face of Heightened Religious Discrimination and Parental Religious Socialization and Muslim American Adolescent Civic Engagement and the Mediating Role of Religiosity. So I'm very honored to present the proposed study and the findings here at this very special research event. And this is what I will be doing in this small talk today. I'll be going over the description of the study, and I'll be reporting my progress and some of my results, and I will end this talk with my concluding remarks. So why is it important to study Muslim adolescents' positive adjustment? So although the Muslim population is the fastest growing religious group in the United States and is projected to double by 2050, little is known about their healthy development. And in addition to developmental challenges associated with the transition into adolescence, Muslim American youth experience stigma, discrimination, and public scrutiny as religious minorities are portrayed as incompatible with mainstream Western societies. And despite these prevailing negative sentiments towards Islam and Muslims in general in the United States continue to engage with both the host culture and their own communities. However, most research on Muslim minority youth focuses on risk factors for their maladjustment, like poor mental health, radicalization, type of outcomes, rather than their positive development, like civic engagement. So the objective of the proposed study is to identify predictors of and underlying mechanisms that explain Muslim American adolescents' positive adjustments in the United States. And focus on positive development of Muslim youth is essential, since there's a critical need to study their strengths, assets, and thriving through their religiosity. And I propose to explore the mediating role of different dimensions of religiosity, namely religious attitudes, practices, and struggles in the relation between maternal religious socialization and civic engagement. And lastly, I'll examine whether these mediated pathways differ by gender. So just to give you a quick kind of conceptual background of the study, civic engagement refers to political and pro-social contributions to one's community and society, including expressing political opinions, like leading community activities and acting for the collective good. And adolescence is a unique period of opportunity as youth become more autonomous and exposed to diverse perspectives and opportunities. And civic engagement is crucial for the positive adjustment of Muslim Americans, as it allows their voices to be heard and promote social justice in response to oppression. And parental religious socialization might be particularly important for the development of civic behaviors and attitudes, since the core teachings of Islam value civic behaviors and encourage young people to participate in religious activities and engaging in volunteering, voting, and participating in political events. And according to Positive Youth Development Framework, religiosity is one of the primary developmental assets fostering youth competency and adjustment. And religiosity may be an important mechanism underlying association between parental religious socialization and civic engagement. And Parental religious socialization is found to be linked to children's greater religiosity, and religiosity actually can serve as a resource for political consciousness and powerful motivator for social action. And moreover, religiosity is multi-phased and complex constructs, and understanding of how different aspects of religiosity uniquely mediates this relation between maternal religious socialization and civic engagement is needed. And specific religious dimensions might be distinctly associated with adolescent civic engagement, such that religious practices, for example, by themselves might not necessarily indicate the internalization of religious virtues that promote civic behavior. And it's important to understand how these mechanisms uniquely contribute to civic development of Muslim youth. And lastly, studies examining the gendered role of religiosity in adolescents' development have consistently shown that women were more religious compared to men, more likely because women might receive religious socialization messages more frequently than men. Thus, gendered religious socialization might be differentially associated with girls' and boys' religiosity, and in turn, their civic engagement. We collected this data. This is actually the extension of the previous study that we're doing in our lab. And the sample in general consisted 234 Muslim American youth who self-identify as Muslim and between the ages of 13 to 18-year-old. And they're recruited from Muslim organizations, Islamic schools, community centers, and online mostly. And after obtaining parental consent and adolescents' assent, participants completed an online culture survey, and these are the measures that we have used. You can see some demographics. Parental religious socialization scale was adapted from ethnic racial socialization scale by Hughes and Johnson. And we also, adolescents also reported on their religious attitudes, practices, struggles, and civic engagement. So where am I now? So we collected the data, ran analysis, and here are my results. So according to our results, maternal religious socialization was positively associated with religious practices and attitudes, whereas it was negatively associated with religious struggles. In addition, religious practices, attitudes, and struggles were also positively associated with civic engagement after controlling for age and socioeconomic status. We ran multi-group analysis and we couldn't see any gender differences, and also the indirect effect of religious attitudes and practices were significant. And so it means that only religious attitudes and practices mediated the relation between maternal religious socialization and civic engagement. So overall, what these results tell to us is that Muslim American adolescents who perceive their mothers as discussing issues around religion and culture or transmitting religious values reported praying, fasting, attending mosque, and seeing their religion as an essential part of their life more often. And they reported having less doubts or struggles with regard to their religious beliefs. And in turn, adolescents who engaged in more religious practices and attitudes were also more likely to engage in volunteering, helping, donating, or viewing active involvement in the community as their part of their responsibility. So this means that internalized motivation for religious practices and attitudes can also fuel adolescents' motivation to learn and care about issues of social justice and equity related to their community and broader society. Consistent with the findings from previous research, Muslim American adolescents' civic engagement might be intricately tied to their level of religious practices and attitudes, given that religious institutions frequently not only provide explicit messages about morality or civic conscience and socially appropriate behavior, but also specific opportunities for youth to become engaged in acts that reflect these messages, like charity drives, like food donation, or voluntarily community activities, etc. So as opposed to what it's believed in in public and maybe in some of the scientific areas, Muslim adolescents' religiosity is not a barrier to their integration into mainstream society. It actually helps them to become more engaged with the society. So there are I'll be talking about some of the implications and limitations of this study. And I will also mention about my own struggles and process of writing grant and putting everything out here. So in terms of the limitations, we relied on cross-sectional data, and adolescents again reported on their own experiences, including how they perceive their parents are talking about religion at home. So we only relied on single reporters. So it would be really nice to have parents included in this study, but honestly speaking, it's very hard to recruit Muslim adolescents, and their parents usually tend to not really want to share their experiences. They really hesitate a lot because of the mistrust, probably. Although you would consider me and other researchers, some of us cultural insiders, and that might really help them talk, help them share, but it's usually not the case. Unfortunately, we're not able to include parents, but maybe in the future and other future studies can consider doing this. And the other limitation that is related to our use of parental religious socialization scale. As I mentioned earlier, we have used Hughes and Johnson's ethnic racial socialization scale. We adapted that to religious practices. But indeed, although it captures some of the religious socialization practices that are facilitated at home, it doesn't completely include some of the specific practices that Muslim parents might engage. For example, for Muslim parents, going to mosque with their adolescents and praying together are really essential part of their socialization practices, but we were not really able to ask those questions. So I've seen some folks and scholars are developing a religious socialization scale which might better capture the nuances in these practices at home for Muslim families, but we were not able to do that in this study, which is a point of further development and growth. In terms of the applications of the findings, there are 2 points that we can easily translate this scientific knowledge into real life applications, which I believe one of is that how parents talk around religion, how their socialization practices about their religion and culture really help youth internalize their religious value and so we can have culturally sensitive prevention intervention programs that are dedicated to parenting education or youth development programs type of things. And the second thing that we can easily again translate into some of the real life applications or implications is that Muslim adolescents' religiosity is actually not really harmful or is not really barrier for them. They can still be religious and they can still be integrated into mainstream society. So in the previous literature and some of the studies from European settings, not necessarily in US context, have shown that when they have stronger sense of belonging to their own religious groups or when they are highly religious, they tend to not become integrated into mainstream society, which our findings really show the opposite. So this information can really inform maybe policymakers, decision-making mechanisms as well. So lastly, in terms of my own barriers, we've been talking about this before the event started, but I will share with everyone now, is that one of the barriers that I face with is I'm from the developmental psych program, and when I do this work, I first go to developmental journals to submit my work. In the last month, I got two of my papers that's rejected because of the reason that one of them said that religion is not a part of culture and you cannot treat it as a part of culture, and that's why they rejected. And the other one said that I've used a very limited sample, so I'm narrowing myself down by doing that. So those were the reasons that I got rejected from developmental journals. And I was encouraged to apply, like resubmit that work to other journals that are like dedicated to studying religiosity and spirituality. So that is the first thing. Like, I don't know if this is really the case for counseling or clinical programs in the US in general, but like in our field, unfortunately, there are times that I feel discouraged about really studying this population and their development, like from a developmental perspective. It's not really appreciated some of the times. I am so grateful for my advisor for being such a great advocate in this field, and like she's super supportive and we do this work together, but I might not be this lucky. And the other thing is that like I appreciate the spaces like Division 36 because it really empowers us and it really makes our voices heard. I feel really welcomed. I feel really seen, and I feel that my research is being validated in this spaces. So I appreciate that a lot. And I feel very honored to be like part of this organization and like be one of the grant recipients. So that was really fascinating to me and I appreciate it a lot. So these are the references in case you want to take a look or take a picture. These are the things that I've used. And yeah, it's the end of my talk. I thank for you coming here and supporting us and listening to my talk.